Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society, Texas. We're honored to partner on this program with our good friends at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. Tonight's program is on current trends and future expectations regarding tariffs and supply chain issues. Tariffs and supply chain concerns are an increasingly critical factor in US-China relations that not only impacts businesses, but has direct consequences on everyday lives of individuals. Despite the achievement of a Phase 1 trade deal, the barriers to trade continue with no indication of going away. Additionally, supply chain issues are compounding as the global economy is starting to emerge from the pandemic. Disrupted supply chains are struggling to bounce back for a variety of reasons, including labor shortages and a lack of key components and raw materials. To discuss some of these topics, we're honored to welcome Dr. John Kent, Director of Supply Chain China Initiatives and clinical professor at the University of Arkansas's Sam Walton College of Business. He's an expert in logistics and transportation and has over 10 years of industry experience in various modes of transportation. Liza Mark started the Shanghai office of Haynes & Boone in 2013 and serves as its chief representative and administrative partner. She's practiced as a US lawyer in Hong Kong and Shanghai for over 22 years. She has concentrated her practice in private equity investments, securities, and cross-border mergers and acquisitions. Moderating the program is David Firestein. He's the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. David is a decorated career U.S. diplomat specializing primarily in U.S.-China relations. Following the program, we'll be taking some viewer questions, so please share your questions through the YouTube comment box. We hope you enjoy the program. Over to you, David.
Very much, Selena. It's always a great pleasure to work with you and the wonderful team here at the Asia Society Texas Center. The George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations is proud to partner with ASTC on this evening's very timely event. As Selena noted, the topic for this evening is current trends and future expectations regarding U.S.-China tariffs and supply chains. The issues of both tariffs and supply chain have dominated U.S.-China discourse and global headlines more generally over the last few years. And we're very fortunate to have with us this evening two outstanding experts on these issues, Dr. John Kent and Ms. Liza Mark, whom Selena introduced a few moments ago. For the next 40 minutes or so, I'll pose a number of questions to John and Liza. For the last 15 minutes of this evening session, we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to pose your questions using the chat function. Questions received in that way will be collected and asked of our experts as time allows toward the end of this evening's session. Without further ado, let's jump right into the moderated discussion. My first question is for both John and Liza, and let's start with the big picture. 3.5 years into the US-China trade war, where is the US-China trade relationship today? And to what degree have the policies enacted over the last several years, particularly on the US side, generated any real decoupling between the United States and China? John?
Okay, I'm trying to think of a word or two. I think variation. In preparation for tonight's webcast, I had thought about explaining sort of the and using an example or a metaphor of a symphony to describe how global supply chains have evolved for 30 years, for 3 decades, We've transitioned from using the word logistics to supply chain management, and in many of our minds, we had reached a point with global supply chains where they were just, in many cases, working like a symphony orchestra. It was like beautiful music. The synchronization of the ships and the ports and the factories and the electronic data interchange going from the stores to almost to the sewing machines in China was just so well synchronized and running so smoothly. And when the disruption occurred 3.5 years ago, I kept telling myself that John, disruption is good. You need disruption to create change and innovation, and maybe we've come complacent. I don't think that anymore. I think the disruption has happened, and I'll still say that was good. There were and still are issues that need to be addressed between the U.S. and China and global trade in general. However, in my mind, it's time to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We had the disruption, but as I think all of us know, halfway into the disruption that was intentionally created from the U.S. side, we have this pandemic. And so we were going into the pandemic, not into a disarray from a supply chain standpoint, but as many of us know, all we have to do is read the news every day. I don't want to use the word crisis because I don't think we're in a crisis from a supply chain standpoint, but we're certainly disrupted. We have stimulus money that's increased flows. And part of your question was the trade between the U.S. and China. We have more products coming from China today than we've ever had, or trying to get here than we've ever had. So we're working through it. And I think you mentioned the word decouple, and I'll finish on that. I guess it's been a couple of years ago now that word decouple, hyphenated word maybe, but that word is part of our jargon now. And I mentioned quimming in our prep time a few minutes ago. And quimming, as many people know, is a strategically located from a distribution standpoint for the countries, Laos and Vietnam and Thailand, and that many people suggest if there's a decouple, maybe it's recoupled there. So I would just say that I don't think decoupling has happened nearly to the extent that I think some people thought or even hoped. And we still have supply chains between the U.S. and China that are in some ways over capacity right now. So we could use a little bit of decoupling for whatever reason, but slowing down. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, John. Lisa, your thoughts, please.
I think you've asked a empirically very exact question, but a much broader kind of question as to what is happening now, or what was planned, and did it happen the way we thought it was going to happen? And I think the answer is a resounding no. The intention was, okay, we're going to have a political conversation or a discussion of trade and the use of tariffs as a leverage mechanism to force certain actions. One, the strategy of this, of using trade to enforce certain actions on the China side, didn't seem to work very well. And two, the pandemic intervened, which caused all sorts of subsequent roll-on or knock-on effects. So if you look at the data right now, certainly from ProPublica, the trade war that was originally started by the US is not having the effects that the US wanted it to have. Trade of goods between the US and China, in fact, has expanded beyond the 2019 situation, right? The we're having more goods go back and forth as compared to what we had in 2019. Now, the trade of services did back off, but I would question whether that was because of the trade war or more because of people actually could not travel due to COVID-19. As for, I think your question is a question of status, right? Where are we now? Then I would say that essentially we haven't achieved, or I would argue that the US side has not achieved what it intended to achieve by starting the trade war. It's not really benefiting itself because its surplus is going sky high, or its deficit is going sky high, sorry. Its people are paying for higher priced goods. China is not changing its behavior. In fact, politically speaking, China and the US are in worse shape as for its relationship. So under those circumstances, I would say that the trade wars doesn't seem to be helping anyone.
Lisa, thank you so much. I want to come back over to John on the topic of supply chains before coming back to trade as well. And of course, the two issues are so intertwined. John, kind of at almost a philosophical level or a theoretical level, to what degree can we say that the shifting of supply chains in the way that we've seen occur over the last several years represents a rejection of the core international trade construct of comparative advantage? And on a related note, Congress has taken an increasingly intense interest in the issue of supply chains, even going so far in some legislation, essentially as to mandate where US companies may and may not put supply chains. Do you think this is an appropriate role for the United States Congress or the US government generally?
No. An appropriate role is clearly defense, I think. And I think much of the activity Congress is some way, and I'm not a politician and I'm not an expert on this defense side, but it's almost like we're using trade and the restrictions and the tariffs, and we have an ulterior motive. And I think maybe that is the ulterior motive. I don't know. As Lisa pointed out, the objectives of the trade war were stated as bringing jobs back to the United States, and that hasn't happened. And I think many people in business don't think that's going to happen unless it's regulated that it would have to happen, and that certainly disrupts the economics theories of free trade. The tariffs do that. An economist will tell you that tariffs are not good for anyone, and I think we're in either country. And I think we're experiencing that. I think we're testing that theory, if you will, of free trade, and we're seeing that that the tariffs aren't helping anyone. And part of my thought process, and it's been this way for since I made a presentation in 2018 at the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals on reducing or eliminating the tariffs. And going and I'm sort of, I don't know about, I'm the only one, because I'm not, but that's the drum that I would be beating is let's talk to each other and work together and take advantages of, you mentioned the comparative advantage of the different advantages that not only US and China, but around the world. Africa's a big play here. In an emerging play, and how does the U.S. and China work together in a constructive way for global trade and lead the world like we really we are on paper two largest economies. We're leading the world from an economic standpoint. So I don't know if I've exactly answered your question or not, but that's my perception.
Let me chime in a little bit here.
Please,
as well.
Thank you.
I think supply chain development is driven by multiple factors, right? If you go back 10, 15 years ago, there is a massive drive for globalization of your supply chain and just in time, because that is how you drive down cost. So if you build certain aspects of your stuff in China and then ship it to Mexico to kind of put it together to then ship it to the US, you might cut some cost out of it, even including all the shipment delays and so on and so forth. So supply chain over a process of time had spread all over the world because they found places to make stuff at the cheapest cost while ensuring quality, a basic level of quality. So under the circumstances, global multinationals went out and tried to find the best place to make stuff. And that's how China developed its huge infrastructure of manufacturing, but not only manufacturing, but logistics of moving massive quantities of goods to the rest of the world. Supply chains are not static, they're always shifting. And so John would be able to explain this much better, but if I'm looking at this, I would say, what are the factors that are incentivizing or pushing the changes of supply chain? And politics is absolutely one factor, right? Tariffs is definitely one factor. Mm-hmm. International relations is definitely one factor. But the question, I guess, to folks that study this or look at this on a daily basis would be, should it be the primary factor? Because if we look at the experiment that we are going through or just went through of the trade war, what we see is if politics becomes the primary factor, people will pay more for the goods. It's not a very effective tool for pushing the other party or incentivizing the other party to do what you want. And you might experience more supply chain breakdowns where you have to start buying your Christmas gifts in August because you don't think that you will actually get your stuff if you leave it until October, right? So I would argue that supply chain and trade, while a tool for incentivizing international good behavior, is probably not the most efficient tool. So going back to your original question of, should Congress be in the job of managing or messing with supply chain? I would say there are legitimate factors that they have to consider. Again, what John said, supply chain of defense material, absolutely. They should be in the job of managing that because that's critical to the country. But should they be in the job of managing the supply chain of cotton? Harder argument.
Lisa, thank you so much. Lisa, I want to continue with you. You mentioned the issue of politics and the impact of politics on some of these issues. During the presidential campaign, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both said from their respective debate stages that they felt that the tariffs were harmful to the United States and to American consumers in particular. Why do you suppose the Biden administration, which has been in office now for over 9 months, has been so evidently reticent to lift tariffs, which the president himself believes are harmful to our nation? And on a related note, and touching on something you said earlier, do you agree or disagree with the assertion commonly put forward by proponents of tariffs that the US tariffs give the United States some kind of, quote, leverage over China?
Wow, David, that is a question that you're probably best suited to answer. And I will note that it is rather dangerous to have a lawyer talk about politics, but I will attempt to answer anyway. It is my job to make sure I understand the at least high-level changes of U.S.-China relations. So I do keep track of this. But I certainly am not a political commentator. I don't know much about politics. I just observe what's going on. From what I'm seeing, at least on the transaction financial side, it strikes me that the Biden administration seems to be biding its time and taking a slow and steady approach of trying to figure out what is the best approach in resetting their relationship with China, or the US-China relationship. I'm very aware that certain policies that the US government puts in place, just like certain policies that the Chinese government puts in place, are harder to back off from. So because the Trump administration has put down a very acute tariff policy, the Biden administration can't really just say, okay, right, we're going to just take it off all right now. Politically, that's not viable. And if you look at how the Biden administration has approached China, you see that they have, one, toned down the rhetoric. There's no longer comments about Kung flu and the Wuhan virus. They've been much more, shall we say, adult about it. Mm-hmm. And they have tried to have more conversations, but they have not had significant and material and substantive changes to the policy. And you do notice that the Chinese side is getting rather impatient. But I am still optimistic and hopeful that they are slowly rolling out some of the more reasonable or backing away from the more unreasonable positions that the prior administration has staked out. So I am hoping that this is a matter of time. But again, I think people are getting to the point where they're asking, well, if you think the policy is not right, how come you're not changing it?
Lisa, thank you. On a related note, I want to ask a closely related question to both John and Lisa. And it stems from something that Lisa just said about the politics and about how the politics can be sticky and it becomes politically difficult to undo something that a previous administration did, which I think is a very accurate assessment. So my question is this: if China were actually to make real and significant changes in its trade policies and economic policies of the type that the United States says that it hopes to see, could recently adopted US laws and policies be rolled back? Or conversely, is there a kind of ratchet effect in which once those laws and regulations are on the books, they are effectively impossible, at least politically, to rescind, even if China solved the underlying issues about which the United States has long had concerns? John, your thoughts on that?
I'm an optimist by nature. As I've grown older, maybe I'm less optimistic about some of this, but I am optimistic that I'll take WeChat. WeChat is an example of something that has changed with the administration. TikTok has changed. And I don't want to talk so much about TikTok, but I could because of the whole retail supply chain orientation that's there. But WeChat is a critical communication tool for anyone doing business in China, period. And if you take that away and you limit that, that inhibits communication. And from a supply chain perspective, from many perspectives, but from a supply chain perspective, that is a problem. That is a barrier. And so it was encouraging to me to see that change. It was encouraging to me to see the Huawei CFO that would. So I guess what I'm getting, I've noticed. I've just articulated too, WeChat and the CFO, and there are a few others, but I'm not excited about the dialogue that I see between the U.S. trade diplomats and China's trade diplomats. The new ambassador from China, Quinn, that was hosted by the Bush China Foundation here not too long ago. I mean, I was excited. I'm ready to I hadn't been on a plane since 2019. I'm ready to go to Washington. I've invited him, not personally, but have tried to send the signal to come to University of Arkansas and meet us and let's talk. And so where I'm going, my train of thought is I think the door's cracked open a little bit to what we're talking about. And not only think that there are some overt behaviors that are promising, but there's not enough roll up our sleeves. Let's get together and solve these problems of trade. Let's talk about tariffs and how that could help both countries with global inflation of prices. I mean, by definition, the math is very simple. This isn't hypothetical. Tariffs add costs to the end consumer, period. It's science. So let's start working through those, and we can tie those to key factors that the politician thinks they need to be addressed, and checks and balances, if you will. But again, I'll use the example, and maybe it's still COVID in the travel restrictions that's inhibiting some of this. The gumbays, the sitting down at dinners, the face-to-face communication that is so critical, even for anyone, for a family, to maintain connections and trust. And so maybe that's why that door's not open more. Maybe it's still a pandemic issue, but I want to think that door will open more. And if we can travel and visit and get the personal relationships that we're managing with Zoom and WeChat, get that going again, I think we'll make more progress in this area.
John, thank you. Lisa, would you like to comment on this particular question?
Sure. I think you have to separate the question with if China does make visible adjustments in response to the U.S., can and will the U.S. in fact back off? This is actually a very multi-leveled question, extremely astute. What we're noticing is the communication between China and U.S. Is demonstrating a recession of trust that is very, very troubling. Right? Without trust, you can't do business.
No.
And so at this point, it's like both sides are fighting, and they're 3 years old, and they're accusing the other side of bad behavior without any pullback on either side of saying, wait, did I do something wrong as well? From what I'm hearing on the ground, the expectation is not only would China have to fulfill the phase one trade deal, which, by the way, they are not fulfilling just yet, considering the trend of the purchases that they've made, but also do something extra before the US would be willing to kind of take certain steps to back off on the tariff. At least that's the expectation from what I'm hearing on the US side. The China side seems to also have that understanding as well. And so their incentive of either one, fulfilling the phase one trade deal, or two, making adjustments to their internal process to address some of the concerns of the US, is receding, right? Because if you don't know where the goalpost is, and the requirements that are requested of you, one, does not seem to be forthcoming, and two, seems to be changing all the time, then it is very natural for human nature to kick in and say, well, I'll just ignore you and do whatever's best for me then, right? So I think we're not back to a much more long-term, let's work together schematic just yet. We're still in a very transactional, I give you this, you give me this. And the gimme is not working very well.
Right. Lisa, thank you. Let me ask two questions. The first one to Lisa and the second one to John, and I'll put them both out there and then y'all can respond. And you may want to respond to the other question as well. But to Lisa, let me put this question to you. Of all the major issues in the US-China bilateral agenda, it would seem to me that trade is, at least theoretically, the least intractable of them. And yet progress on trade has been incredibly slow going. In fact, it's hard to even discern that there has been progress in many respects. Why is that? Why can't smart people on both sides, after all these years and indeed decades, find a viable, mutually acceptable way forward on these particular technical issues? Or are they, in fact, intractable after all? And let me ask a question to John. Looking out into the future, and it relates to the question that I've posed to Lisa, is the current US concern, I would say deep concern, about China's role in global supply chains something that will pass in some number of years? Or on the contrary, do you think that this deep concern that we see today will extend out indefinitely or permanently? Lisa first.
Sure. In fact, in my mind, there are three areas that are shall we say, not intractable and would be beneficial, very beneficial for both countries to work together. The first would be climate change. The second would be dealing with the pandemic that is actually covering the globe. And the third would be trade, right? It is to everybody's benefit if these two countries could sit down in an adult manner and actually work together in a reasonable manner to try to solve all of these three problems. I believe that the tone of the conversation has fundamentally changed since the prior administration. And once you fundamentally change the tone from we're all friends, we have differences, but let's sit down and talk about it and solve it, to we are enemies, or we are at the very least dire competitors, and it's either your benefit or my benefit, and there is no middle ground, it becomes very, very difficult to work together, even on things where it's bloody obvious it would benefit both sides to work together on. I am concerned because the tone has a momentum of itself. Once you start a blood feud, it's kind of hard to go back and say, no, we're brothers. I don't know how to kind of tone it down. I am hopeful that the current administration, being more experienced in diplomacy, might be doing the right thing. Their slow response of taking off the tariffs, of doing some of the other stuff and reversing the prior administration's policy might be a good step in trying to lower the temperature and try to back away from the precipice of a blood feud, right? Look, if you had a blood feud the day before and you suddenly say we're brothers the next day, nobody would believe you. But if you say, let's have a chill out period and maybe then slowly find ways to work together, that might be a more reasonable approach. At least that's my hope.
Thanks, Lisa. And John, again, your thoughts on will this notion of let's get supply chains out of China be a permanent feature of the U.S. mindset on trade going forward, in your judgment?
It's not the mindset of the multinationals right now. So, I think of the multinationals, it wasn't the mindset 2.5 years ago. And so if we use those two data points to predict the future, no, it's not the mindset of the multinational. And when I say multinational, many people believe that it's a one-way street, that it's China supplying the U.S. There are Tesla, General Motors, Ford, Caterpillar, on and on. There are Walmart examples of bilateral trade, taking advantage of the markets in China, in addition to the supplies coming from China. So I think looking at just the multinationals, there is, as we've mentioned already in the conversation, they're looking, Lisa mentioned, around the world for low cost, for emerging markets. And so I think looking into the future, using that to project, the multinationals will continue to desire to keep a connection in China, both directions.
John, let me just ask a quick follow-up question, because you make a great point, and one that I think all of us that follow these issues understand, as you do, that basically the U.S. business community, and in particular the multinationals, are against these policies because these policies don't serve their interests. They don't serve the interests of their shareholders, of their companies, and so on. And I guess my question is, at least at the kind of theoretical or conventional wisdom level, in terms of one's understanding of the U.S. political process, historically, one would presume that if pretty much the entire U.S. economy and the entire U.S. business community were against something, that something wouldn't happen. It wouldn't be adopted. The policies in question wouldn't be adopted by the U.S. government. Why has the U.S. government, the Congress and the executive branch, been able to adopt and sustain policies that are so bad for America by every metric that you could possibly cite, and that are so unwelcome by virtually the entire U.S. business community? How do you explain that?
I explain that as the entire U.S. business community is not voting. And it's the individuals, and I love Arkansas. I was born and raised here, and then moved away for 30 years and have come back. But I have friends that when I go to a high school reunion, I'm a trader.
Yeah.
So it's that's what I think of. There's not a global mindset in the worldview of so many. I didn't realize it was so many Americans.
Right.
And so I guess that's part of it. One thing I want to tag on to are the three areas that Lisa mentioned with the tone coming out of Washington: the pandemic, climate change, and trade. The tone is drastically changed on two of the three. It's just not changed on trade, the one that we're talking about. Now, have we done anything about it yet? No, but the tone's changed. The philosophical view of climate change and the pandemic is not controversial, I don't think, with the current administration. Mm. Now, Congress, that's still fairly balanced, then it's different. But I think the view coming out of the Biden administration is much more in sync with each other or has the potential of being. And I think trade has the potential of being. But anyway, I just wanted to tie into those two.
I'd like to get Lisa's take on this, but before that, I just want to inject into the conversation one specific data point that is in absolute alignment with points that both Lisa and John, that both of you have made. And that is, in terms of the impact of the tariffs, there is no question that the impact has been negative, just as you've both noted emphatically. And to add a specific data point to that in support of that assertion, the Bush-China Foundation actually calculated the average annual merchandise deficit of the last several presidents, including President Trump. So not just in any one year, but the average annual merchandise trade deficit with China across the presidency. And by doing that and getting an average number, you can compare a presidency to another presidency because you have an average number. And what happened under the trade policies of the Trump administration is that the Trump administration generated the highest average annual merchandise trade deficit in America's history, by far. It was 17%, specifically 17% greater than that of the Obama administration, notwithstanding the fact that that President Trump referred to the policies of President Obama as a complete failure. And yet he outperformed, if you will, by 17% those deficit numbers and became the deficit president in American history and the deficit president of the United States. And yet, as you point out, John, a lot of people don't know the numbers, but even when they do, they don't seem to care. And if I may just make one point before going to Lisa, I will say I think the untethering of U.S. political and public policy discourse from factual reality is by far the gravest threat that we face in the United States of America today. And if we don't rectify it, we will never outcompete China, and we will never solve the nation's public policy problems unless we tether ourselves back to factual reality. But Lisa, what do you think? I didn't mean to do too long of a monologue there, but I just wanted to make those points. What are your thoughts about why we have these policies continuing in the face of pretty strong opposition from the business community, the corporate sector, which in many cases you work so closely with?
Thank you, David. I think you've put your finger right on it. Fear. A lot of how the tariffs and the trade war was sold as, okay, normal Americans that are in the middle of the country, that are working manufacturing jobs, your jobs are disappearing, your pay is not increasing, and your lives are going worse and worse because all your jobs are being stolen by Chinese manufacturers. We know that is not true because, again, data point, in a very recent survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, they surveyed all of the American businesses that were members and asked them all, are you moving your supply chain? And if you are you moving them back to the US? Zero. Nobody said they're moving it back to the US. Only about 10% said they are contemplating moving it out to Southeast Asia. And so under those circumstances, it's bloody obvious that multinationals, corporates that have far-flung supply chains are not contemplating bringing in manufacturing jobs to the US. There are very good commercial reasons for it. But how is it sold? Why is it happening on the political sphere? Probably because the US is going through a transition of its workforce. And the folks, whenever there's disruption, whenever there's a transition of how our economy works, certain folks would be disadvantaged by it. And the politicians have taken advantage of that disadvantage and sold everyone on fear. That's unfortunate.
Absolutely. And it's taken us down a path, as both of you have noted, that is bad for our country by, again, virtually every metric, from consumer prices to jobs lost, which the U.S.-China Business Council estimates is approximately 250,000 lost jobs as a result of these policies, and the list goes on. I think we're now at the point where we have some questions from our online audience, and I want to share some of those with you. One question comes in and touches on something that y'all have discussed in a bit, but I think it's worth drilling down on, and that's the issue of the distinction between a legitimate, perhaps congressional or U.S. government interest in ensuring the integrity of and the inviolability, if you will, of supply chains relating to national defense. But on the other hand, is that an appropriate role relative to purely commercial areas? And we touched on this. Do we see a trend, in your judgment, John and Lisa, in the United States to extend the definition of national defense to the point where it includes toys, lawn chairs, cotton, tomatoes, and every other thing that you can think of, and to simply say, well, this is now a matter of national security, and therefore we have to adjust supply chains accordingly? Do we see that kind of mission creep as a trend line in U.S. governmental efforts to shift supply chains out of China? John, maybe first.
We hear the rhetoric. I don't know that I see physical changes. I don't see that. They would be so small that they're insignificant. And if we declare that, then where are we going to source this from? In my mind, we don't have enough employees to do many of the jobs that we're talking about now. And so, as Lisa pointed out, they're not moving back to the U.S. So where are they going to go? And is that going to be a defense issue with that country as well? And what comes to my mind is a strong State Department is a much better way of dealing with defense than what we're talking about, in a diplomatic way. But we've got so much trust, so I don't want to take off down that too far. But I don't see I hear the rhetoric, and I believe it's less than half of the people in the United States that are voting. I believe that, but it's about half apparently. It could go either way at any given time, so it's not everyone. So that's my take. I hear it, but I don't see it. And I think the reason I don't see it is, where's it going to go? I mean, we talk about a few small countries, maybe that there's been some trial and error there. But as Lisa pointed out, I follow the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai and some of the reports, and it's the fear. I mean, if I'm a CEO of a multinational and I don't have at least a little bit of my time looking at this, then I'm probably not doing my job right. I need to at least be investigating this as plan C or D because of the rhetoric.
So what are your thoughts on this particular topic?
Yes, I believe it is happening. And more importantly, let's not forget that trade is both directions, right? So it's not just goods being supplied from China to the US, but a lot of times it's goods, technology, information coming from the US to China. China actually buys a lot of stuff from the US. If you're asking whether there's mission creep and everything being characterized as national security, yes, just look at the regulations that came out. CFIUS was already a fairly tight limitation on foreign investment into the US. FIRMA, that came out in 2018, expanded that regulatory coverage by a lot. Yeah. Because the economy and the society is changing. We went from hard ammunition as a critical national security issue to technology and sophistication as a national security issue to now going to data as a national security issue. So you see the shifts of what is
Right.
matters that need to be controlled from, okay, you can't buy guns or the technology to build a bomb, to, okay, we're having a fight about 5G,
Right.
to, okay, we can't have you have ownership of certain data sets or have access to companies that own certain data sets, like LGBT dating platforms.
Right.
So you're shifting because you're now saying, oh, wait, hold on. This is critical to national security. Oh, wait, hold on. Another thing is critical to national security.
Yeah.
So under those circumstances, you are seeing a broadening of things that are covered.
And seemingly it becomes a very slippery slope, I think it's fair to say. Let me ask you in the brief time that we have left, maybe about 9 minutes or so, another question to both of you, maybe first to Lisa and then to John on a more specific element of the question. And that is on something that Lisa mentioned earlier, the phase one trade deal. Could each of you just share your thoughts on, number one, what is the status of the phase one trade deal? And number two, specifically for John, to what degree did the phase one trade deal have a bearing on the specific issue of supply chains? And where are we going with the phase one deal? Is it still relevant? Is it still achievable? Or is it, in a sense, almost overtaken by events at this point? But Lisa first, and then John on that topic.
Your answer actually has a very objective answer to it, but everybody looking at the phase one trade deal is actually trying to answer a bigger question. The objective answer is, okay, the phase one trade deal is actually a buy-sell agreement.
Yeah.
Right. The Chinese side said we will buy a certain level of agricultural goods, a certain level of something others. And are they meeting that target? Well, we actually have a tracker for that. Well, we don't, but there are trackers for this. And if you're interested, PIE actually does put out a track of have they fulfilled the phase one trade deal. And the kind of answer is up to August, not really. At least they haven't kept pace with the expected kind of pacing that they would need to fulfill it all at the end of the year. Now, they might, the Chinese side might argue that we're going to make huge purchases at the back end at the end of the year, but these are very large numbers. As for whether the phase one trade deal is serving its purpose, not just buying goods, but serving its purpose of sort of cooling down the situation and chilling out the trade war so that both countries could get back to a more normal trade position, I would argue that subsequent events have overtaken the phase one trade deal's purpose. And so it's not really serving what it's supposed to be serving as a stepping stone to the next phase where they talk about more substantive issues rather than just sort of put a bandage on it.
Thank you, Lisa. John.
So from the supply chain perspective, the physical movement of goods and where they're manufactured and the type of goods, other than some of the technological aspects, I mean, those have literally stopped in some cases. It's still occurring. Your last option there, if the circumstances sort of overtaken, what the thesis was or the goal was of trade. Well, I think the pandemic has caused much more variation. I started off with using the word variation in our supply chains that have created much of the disruption that we're seeing. But from a trade perspective, as we've already noted, that there's more trade coming. There are more products coming from China to the U.S. from a dollar value than there have been in the past. So the supply chains are I hesitate to say are still working like a symphony because they're not. But because of all this variation, the standard deviation is the mathematical measure of variation that is in many of the inventory calculations that are used to determine safety stocks and order quantities. And that's variation in the order cycle time. The order cycle from just on the ocean from China to the US is nearly doubled. And so the average is more, the variation is more, so you need more containers, you need more ships, you need more airplanes to do just the same amount of work we used to do. And so the ports are still running, trucks are still running, they're almost at tilt capacity. And from an operations management standpoint, you don't want to be at 100% of your capacity. You want to be at 80, 85 or so. That's when things run the best. And so we're pushing that. So that part of supply chain has changed. But I don't think it's changed because of the trade deal. I think it's changed because of the pandemic. And that's clouded some of the progress that we might have seen otherwise. And
if I may, I'd like to add a little bit here as well.
Yeah.
The supply chain situation, at least for goods coming from China to the US, has changed massively, as John mentioned, partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic situation and the difficulty of moving goods logistically, but also because the US purchasing pattern has significantly changed. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe that because everybody was locked at home, they significantly reduced their purchase of services like getting a manicure, getting a dinner, and significantly increased their purchase of goods. So if you are, because of the pandemic, already stressing your supply chain system, the logistical actual movement of goods, and you're suddenly adding massive amounts of demand to, oh, and by the way, I want to buy like 20% more of what I used to buy, then you're causing havoc.
Yeah.
And then you add in the sort of unusual events like a typhoon or a oil spill or a Suez Canal being blocked by a super gigantic container ship for a week and a half. Then you have massive dislocations where it takes time to cycle through.
Lisa, I think, please, John, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we haven't mentioned stimulus, and you didn't use that word, Lisa, but that extra buying, what we're seeing is that stimulus money, because it's not being spent in other places, it's products. And so there's a bullwhip effect, and we have peaks and valleys that are bigger, but I know we're out of time.
No, thanks. That's a really good point to make, John. And I think it relates to the broader point that China is not the only source or even necessarily the most important source of the U.S. overall trade deficit or even the U.S. trade deficit with China. In other words, China does some things that are very problematic from a U.S. vantage and against the rules in some cases. But that's not the only reason that the deficit is the size that it is. There are structural reasons. There's tax policy. There's spending exceeds saving, and so on and so forth. And politically, none of those things are ever discussed. But in many ways, they have much more explanatory value as to why the deficit is the size that it is. I want to just give each of you 30 seconds before we conclude here to just offer a 30-second take to a very big question, and that is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about where this trade relationship is going based on what you see now over the next 5 to 10 years? Just in about 30 seconds each. First, John, then Lisa, and then I will wrap up at that point.
The change in administration has provided a glimmer of hope for being optimistic. It's just a glimmer. I used the metaphor earlier about the doors cracked. It's not opened up as much as I had hoped. And again, I would say that may be because of travel. But I look forward to when I can travel again and hopefully physically work on some of these issues. And I hope there are many others of us in supply chain management that appreciate the global economy that are looking forward to it as well. So if we can travel, maybe I'm more optimistic.
John, thank you so much. Lisa, your thoughts?
I'm optimistic on the volume of trade and the development of trade, but I am more pessimistic about the US-China relationship. Optimistic on trade because China and US, their economies, their people, their position in the world are very, very intertwined. We used to hear the word decoupling, but that's not really possible because of so intertwined, the level and the mass of the intertwining. So trade is one of the few areas where, again, it's bloody obvious that everybody would benefit if you manage to work together. So I'm optimistic that in the next 5 to 10 years, this would be the area where it's the easiest to kind of work together, which means it would be allowed to flourish. But I'm less optimistic about where the relationship is headed, mostly because of my view of the level of trust receding. It's which direction are we headed on the trust issue? And I don't think we're headed in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Well, it's time to wrap up this evening's program. And I want to thank both John Kent and Lisa Mark for their time and for sharing with all of us their deep knowledge and insights. And on behalf of both the Asia Society Texas Center and the Bush China Foundation, I want to thank all of the members of our audience for spending this evening with us. It's been our honor and our pleasure to have this time together. We look forward to seeing you again at upcoming events. For now, all the best, and thank you so much again.
Shishik and Bukachik.